2023 marks the 10th anniversary of PareComic, a graphic novel about a participatory economy. We'll talk with the author, Sean Michael Wilson, in this episode of Pep Talk.
Could you please tell us what you see as the alternative?
Hello and welcome to Pep Talk, the Participatory Economy podcast, the podcast where we discuss the democratic alternative to capitalism known as the participatory economy. I'm your host, Micheal, coming to you from Chicago. I'm joined by Antti, who is a longtime political activist, writer, and advocate of the participatory economy model, who is joining us from Helsinki, Finland. Antti, welcome.
Thanks, glad to be here.
Antti and I are joined by Sean Michael Wilson, who is joining us from Kumamoto, Japan. Sean Michael Wilson is a graphic novel writer. He's the author of many works. In this episode, we'll focus in particular about his book entitled PareComic, The Story of Michael Albert and Participatory Economics, published by Seven Stories Press. Sean, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Before we begin, let me just first remark that Sean is in Japan, Antti is in Finland, I'm in Chicago in the United States. We are spanning the globe on this. It is right now in Chicago as we're recording this, 8 a.m. for me in Chicago, 4 p.m. in Helsinki, and 11 p.m. for Sean in the evening in Japan. So we're actually spanning the globe and spanning the clock as we perform this. I'm glad everyone could do this. We've truly annihilated space and time. Sean, let me begin with you and ask you, we're going to focus on your work. You've done a great many works over your career. We're going to focus on one in particular, PareComic, The Story of Michael Albert and Participatory Economics. Let me first ask, what motivated you to write the comic?
Well, to answer that, I have to go all the way back to when I was about 16 or 17 and started getting into so-called political things. And actually, I don't really remember how or why I got into that, but I did an article criticizing Margaret Thatcher when I was 17 in school. And I've still got that because I'm one of those people that likes keeping everything, you know. So I've still got that. And I was looking at it the other day and thinking, oh, it's quite well written for a 17-year-old. But I don't actually recall how I started getting into that because no one in my family is left-wing. They were all liberals, as in the Liberal Party in the UK, not this kind of strange version of that you say in the USA where liberal means left wing,
right?
Which I still think is weird. Because liberal is not left wing. But anyway, my family all voted for the Liberal Party, which were the dominant party in Scotland until the Labour Party took over. And so there's no one in my family who's at all left wing. I was the first one, so I don't recall what put me in that direction. But then when I went to university in Glasgow, I studied sociology and psychology, and of course started to learn more about the actual theoretical elements of various left-wing approaches and economics in general. And so the key thing is, at that time I already loved comic books because I loved comic books since I was 12. And at my age, that was a good age to be into comic books because Alan Moore, the comic book writer, Alan Moore, was just getting into swing, and he wrote V for Vendetta, which I first read when I was 12. And that's an amazing thing to read when you're 12. You're only 12 years old. And that kind of thing puts into you this idea that, well, comic books are not at all just for children. They're very, very sophisticated. So I always had this love of comic books since I was 12 years old, and then learning the theoretical elements of various social science things when I was 18, 19, 20 in Glasgow. Because obviously I'm from Scotland, although I live in Japan now.
Right.
And so I always wanted to combine those two. And I was lucky because two of the people in the university were, they're both dead now, actually. One guy just died a couple of years ago. Mike Scott was a painter as well as a sociologist. Right. And then there was another guy who was a poet as well as a sociologist. And so they were my tutors in Glasgow. And so I was already into this idea that you can combine art and social sciences, so to speak, but those two guys were living examples of that when I was 18, 19 in Glasgow. And so they influenced me to follow this idea of combining my love of comic books with interest in social sciences and history and politics in general. And I happen to be left wing. If I was right wing, I'd be doing right wing comic books, I guess.
About the book PareComic, it's I guess kind of it is a biography, at least in the early parts, of the life of Micheal Albert, who is one of the co-creators of the model of a participatory economy that Antti and I and many others have worked around and advocated around. But you don't just stick to that. You do other things in the book. When most notable, it turns out that you have a conversation where Micheal Albert interacts with Karl Marx in a conversation, despite the fact that, well, let's look through the history here. Karl Marx died in 1883. Micheal Albert was born in 1947. That is a 64-year difference between the two, but it doesn't matter. You can have a conversation with them. What was the inspiration for doing that?
Well, that's the whole thing about art, because in art you can do things which don't happen in real life. When I'm in it too, that's me actually. And on the next page is the artist Carl. So the thing is, I've done a whole bunch of these books now. I've done more than 40 books, comic books in total, and I'm working on 2 more kind of so-called political books. So that would be like number 11, number 12. So I've already done 12 of these kind of social issue books, if you like. So, but the thing is, you want to try and, just as a creator, you want to try and do it in an interesting way for yourself. I'm pretty selfish in that way. That's the main reason. That's the main thing I'm thinking about when I'm doing books, is what's going to be interesting for me and the artist to create. But in this case, it's a question of taking Michael's individual story, as you mentioned, the wider political and cultural things that were happening mainly in the USA in the 1960s and 70s,
right,
including his connection with Chomsky, and an examination of the kind of theoretical and let's say vision aspects of participatory economics. So there's a whole bunch of things to combine in that. So the question is how to do that in a way which is, on the one hand, accurate to the original ideas or history or person, and visually interesting. So there's those kind of 2 poles is what we're thinking about, myself and the artists. And we work together in a very tight and equal team. Doing these books is in itself a kind of participatory act of creativity, because we work together as equals. So we have to think about how can we do it in a visually interesting way, but keep accurate to the information. That's the basic 2 things that we think about for everything. So in this particular PareComic book, more or less the first 2 or 3 chapters are following Micheal chronologically from when he's 14 up to when he's about 60 odd. And the various things which happened in American society then, his connection to Noam Chomsky, what was happening in terms of gender and racial politics mainly in the USA, and the development with Robin. How do we pronounce Robin's second name? Is it Hanel? I've never known how to pronounce it.
Yep.
Hanel.
Mm-hmm.
With him and Robin developing the early ideas in the 70s and 80s. But the thing about that as a creator is that if you're following an actual person's story, it's not so easy to get ideas in and theory, because basically when it comes down to it, you can do these things in movies or in comic books in 2 different ways. You can have a kind of overview of the narration style, in which you can get lots of ideas in, or you can kind of go into the person's life as they're sitting there in their living room talking to their friend having a beer, and you can show the personal elements a lot more, but you can do a lot less elements of the theory and the ideas, because generally speaking, even people like ourselves do not sit there with our friends over a beer in long theoretical sentences. That's partly why we have these kind of interviews, because This is a different type of human communication where we can speak for 2 minutes without someone interrupting us, right? But normally people don't speak like that. And if you put it into comic books or movies, it just looks artificial. Now, so then that's the thing, how to show long conversations which are going into theory and organizational elements and vision in a way which is in some way acceptable. Now, what the last section is basically kind of like online chatting in visual comic book form, but we've got a whole bunch of people, including I've forgotten who half of them are because I wrote this 10 years ago now. It looks like Lenin on the bottom there, and is Bakunin maybe, and I've forgotten who this woman is here now. One of Michael's acquaintances. Yeah, and Marx is in it too, as you said, and Marx and Bakunin. So of course this is just a kind of joke. Really, it's a light-hearted joke. Because the thing about these comic books is that when they are so-called serious, but if you read them, my stuff there's quite a lot of humor in even the serious stuff. And my personality is I'm quite a laid-back person who likes to think seriously about things and does not thinking seriously is a difficult thing. It's an enjoyable thing. So I tried to put that kind of spirit of my own personality in the comic books where the thing is serious, but we do it in a relatively laid-back way. So it doesn't really matter that he's talking to Marx, someone from 50, 100 years ago, and then there's a bit in there where he's talking to me, and another bit where he's talking to Chomsky. It's all just theoretical. I mean, not theoretical. It's all just artistic license.
Right.
Because the point is, how can we put this over in an interesting visual way that doesn't look too artificial? So that's the kind of things we're thinking about. Sorry, it's a long answer, but some of these things require long answers.
Absolutely.
I'm here mainly as a fan and as a reader. I think I was it was some sort of crowdsourcing campaign that you.
Yeah, I was just reminding myself that your name's in the back of the book.
Okay.
I saw that today. a bunch with some people I know, some people I don't know. I said, "Oh, there's Antti's name."
Yeah, there's a lot of names there. Yeah, and that's a good thing. That's a very good thing. But I liked about the book is I liked a lot of things about it, but now that you said about the laid back attitude, I think that's very fitting because, for example, me and Micheal, we work a lot with participatory economy and ideas for changing our economic system to a democratic one, and it's a very serious thing, but it's also a very long-term thing. And I think a mistake that sometimes is made is that everything has to change right now. And this is something that Micheal actually has talked about as well. Because things aren't going to change like in an instant. And that's why it's going to take probably several lifetimes, several generations for big changes to come. And that's why I think why I like the laid back attitude of the comic book. Because that way, through its form, I think it messages very well that these are very serious issues that we live throughout our lives, and we will have to ponder, and we need to ponder, and we can't sort of escape them. And that's also, I think, something that I think Micheal's thinking also brought into the book, because Micheal thinks about this a lot, that, these are things that we have to get moving, but will take an enormous amount of time and commitment and so on. So I think that somehow that comic book really encapsulates it well, and I think laid back attitude is part of that. I really liked it.
Well, this is a slightly different subject, but the thing about Micheal and of course Noam as well is that they're both at an advanced age now, but they're both still very active, and that's really inspirational. Because I mean, how old is Noam? Noam is about 86.
He's 94.
Right?
94.
He's 94 now.
Yeah.
Right, and he's still doing things like every day.
Right.
It's very, very impressive. I mean, not just going to the park and feeding the ducks, but well, not that there's. Well, I think that's one of the things that Micheal said about Noam, that he's maybe not laid back enough. He's too working all his life.
Take the afternoon off. Come on.
take a break there, Noam San.
Yeah.
Right. I said Noam San there. Sometimes I speak Japanese words without realizing I'm doing it.
Oh, no, I'm San.
Maybe
Yeah,
you know
that's
the
true.
word San, right?
San,
That's
yeah.
good.
San
Yeah,
is
the
respect.
honorific for someone like Mr. or Sir. Mm-hmm.
Fan conversation, but
I was speaking in.
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, please.
Yeah. The couple of times I've met Noam and had lunch with him, he is very serious and he's obviously a workaholic. But I also think that he has mischievousness in him, and he's sort of a fun guy. So
I think this is a very significant point, because the idea or the image of people who wish to do politics, and especially people who are on the left, is over serious.
Right.
And that, I think, is a very significant psychological block, because we're talking about how people can get into things via their psychological image of this kind of activity. Psychology matters very much in terms of political activity, and because it's a block to people getting involved in, again, as I say, so-called political activity. Right. And one of those blocks is the idea that it's too serious. Right. And it always reminds me of Emma Goldman. Is it Emma Goldman or Rosa Luxemburg now? I forget which of the two said it, but if I can't dance, it's not my revolution. I think Emma Goldman said that.
It's Emma Goldman who said that.
Right. And I think that's a very, very important point. You know, if I can't enjoy it, it's not my revolution. If I can't joke in the process, it's not the kind of revolution I want to go along with. Because after all, what are we trying to create? We're trying to create a society in which not just people there's more economic fairness, if you want to call it that, or there's less power abuse, but in which people are happy,
right,
and can laugh and joke and relate to each other in that human way. And the whole idea that left-wing people are not like that is really wrong, and I think a big barrier for progress.
Now, that kind of leads to a thought in my mind on that I can understand the kind of seriousness that is kind of infused politics on the left, because admittedly they're dealing with, serious issues. When you're dealing with, institutional, bombing and murder and police brutality and all kinds of serious issues. Yeah, these are, when you're trying to wrestle with that, that's not a joking matter. So I can understand that the reputation is kind of developed on that side. At the same time, though, you're right about the wanting to make sure that that there's a humanity, as it were, regarding our political and institutional relations, which we really do not largely have now. And I think that's actually where I think the suggestion about the bringing the joking element about it could turn it on its head. I mean, actually, this kind of is reflected somewhat in the book PareComic itself. You're talking about the political ferment in the United States in the 1960s and activism there. Some of the elements about that were some of the political activism there was of a joking manner. Abby Hoffman and the Yippies, for example, they did a lot of stunts, like throwing money outside of a stock exchange, things like that. They'll do all kinds of, nominating a pig as president of the United States, all kinds of, crazy, wacky things to help to kind of point the absurdity of things as they currently stand, and trying to turn that on its head. I suppose there could be some way where this normal reputation of things could be reversed. It's the other side, who are, the sour-faced, serious people who just want to conquer the world and never have any fun. But it's the people on the left who recognize that, no, we're not just all automata to be plugged into a machine. We're human beings with real needs, and some of that time that involves having fun. So anyway, just a thought there.
This reminds me of a joke that was on the Real Utopia newsletter like last month. What was it? Why do anarchists drink herbal tea? because all property is theft.
Ah,
I like that. I like that.
that's good.
Anyway, so but the thing is, basically, comic books kind of fit pretty much neatly into that, because comic books have, of course, an image of being easy and about comedy. Now, ironically, one thing comics don't do very well is comedy. This is a very odd thing, because in
Right.
comedy, I think you need sound and facial expressions in the immediacy to do comedy well. And comic books don't have that. They have facial expressions, but they don't have sound.
Right.
So ironically, comic books do not do comedy very well. That's a kind of a strange thing to say. They're much better at doing sophisticated, important, serious subjects. Because the great thing about comic books, and this is where it really fits into this whole thing we just mentioned, is that people think they're easy to read, right? Whether they are or not. And so this is a kind of incorrect, cliched idea. Kimari monku in Japanese. I was talking about that yesterday and explaining to one of my students what it means in English, cliche. And so the cliche of comic books is they're easy to read. Now that I think is very, very significant, because if you give somebody this comic where, any kind of comic on a serious issue, and the fact that there are illustrations in it, they're already not blocked off from thinking this is going to be something difficult to read and I'm never going to, they just never read it and it sits on their shelves for years. There's not that psychological block from reading the thing. But because comic books textually can be at exactly the same level of sophistication as a text version, they can be. The reader can take in the same information anyway.
Yeah.
And of course, then the second thing is, because there are visuals, they can take it in different ways. They take it in two ways. Well, I mean, Will Eisner talked about the thing about comic books. It's like a kind of ballroom dancing, and with the two partners, the movement of the two partners. In this case, the partners are art and text, and the movement across the room of the two partners is what creates the beauty. And that's the thing about comic books. The text can be at exactly the same level as, say, Micheal and Noam write, or anyone. Not necessarily, they can be at lower levels, but they can be at exactly the same level. And because we have the visuals, it means we process it visually in some way which, according to some studies, helps us understand it more deeply and helps us to recall it too. That's the other thing. Noam has an incredible memory. That's one of the things about Noam, right? It's an amazing memory. I don't have a very good memory. But according to various studies, if you have a comic book presentation of something, it helps you recall it as well, easier than just text. And I think that's very significant.
And that kind of points to one strength of comic books, or the graphic novel medium, in that you can actually do, I mean, like Antti and I will read anything you put in front of our faces, but, not everyone will be like that. And so that's where the strength of a graphic novel, a comic book, as it were, comes to play. You can outreach to people who would never pick up a book, and that's probably quite a lot of people, but they might pick up a comic book and read that and, be exposed to some ideas. Does that mesh with what you know about this?
Absolutely. And the thing is, I think, as I said, this comes down to basically psychology and also education as well, because people are educated to think that history and economics and sociology are difficult, boring subjects.
Right.
Especially in Japan. I mean, you might think this is bad in America, but it's even worse in Japan. I don't wish to criticize the Japanese education system, which I do actually. But young Japanese people really have a bad attitude towards history and economics and sociology. They think it's a terribly dry, boring thing because it is the way they're taught it, right? But of course, you have manga in Japan too, right? Or manga, as you pronounce it in America. How do you pronounce it? You pronounce it in some strange way. Sorry, Americans. Anyway,
that's right.
There's a whole bunch of intelligent things that Japanese people will read in manga, right? That they will, again, just turn off. So it's absolutely incorrect ideas about how easy and difficult things are. But we can use that incorrect presumption to put over interesting ideas in graphic novels. And that's partly what I've been trying to do now. This year is 20 years since my first book came out at the end of this year. So I've been doing it for 20 years now.
Additionally, the one thing I like is that sort of do the dance you described of art and text. The writer has to be concise. And that's, I think, in many cases, that's a very good thing, that you have to sort of think about what's the core, what's the focus you want in the text.
Exactly.
And that, I think, is very useful, because a lot of writing is too long, because there are certain assumptions, like a book, how long it's supposed to be. And for example, for serious topics, a writer, and I do this myself as well, writer always has to sort of have these imaginary critics that you're responding to and make sure you have all the right disclaimers and so on. Whereas I think more concise form allows you to just say sort of the core of the idea. And I think you do that very well.
Well, I think that's probably my greatest skill. I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily a good writer, and I don't really think about that or care about it. What I care about is that it's interesting for me to do these books. But if I self-analyze, I think probably my greatest skill in this case is to put over complicated things in easier, concise ways. And again, I learned that in university in Glasgow. That's one of the things that you're supposed to learn in university, to be analytical skills and to explain it in a simple, clear way, which are two massively important skills, which most people don't develop.
Right.
I mean, we're talking about the weaknesses of education, is that most people don't develop the ability to analyze things and to convey them in eloquent, simple ways. But those two skills, if we had those two skills, the world would be in a massively better situation than it is. There wouldn't have been Brexit. There wouldn't have been Donald Trump. The whole, if we had just those two skills.
Right.
People should be reading comics more.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, please.
It's been 10 years, Sean, since PareComic was first published. What has been the reaction to the book in those 10 years?
Well, first of all, I should say a very simple thing is that what does the title actually mean, PareComic? And basically, it was a joke that became reality because, of course, it's obviously participatory economics, PareCon.
Right.
And it is a comic.
Right.
So when I was discussing it with Micheal, well, originally like 12 years ago, because it took us about 2 years to do it, I just used that as a shorthand title, PareComic. And after you've been saying that for about 2 years, you're thinking, oh, that is the title now. So, but I think I'm glad that we used that joke became the reality. Well, the thing is, of course, everybody who reads it likes it and enjoys it and it's had good reviews. But the thing about these kind of things in general is they don't sell enough, they don't reach enough people. And I think that's our biggest problem. I've said this on various forums, but I'm not really keen on in-depth theoretical discussions amongst ourselves. I think we need to do much more outreach, as they say, and get the basic ideas out to people more, because I guess some people disagree with that point, but it does seem to me that we need to do a lot more of that kind of thing. And that's the key reason why I do these kind of comic books, apart from my own enjoyment of it, is I think it is a good way to reach out to more people. And generally speaking, my comic books, people react to them very well. But it's just not enough people. We need more people. Not just for my comic books, for these kind of podcasts and all media which is trying to do something interesting and intelligent. We need more people. And that, I'm very optimistic, but on this point, I feel rather negative, because it still seems that if you want to get a lot of people, you need to have cats falling off roofs. You get 10 million people watching that, and you get, even Noam only gets 10,000 or 100,000 people talking about something very, very interesting. right? And then the cat falling off a roof will get 100 times even what Noam gets. This depresses.
We could maybe combine the two. Maybe we'll have Noam throw a cat off a roof and then have them talk while we're doing that, so they can get increased coverage of ideas.
I recognize the sentiment very strongly. It's also something I have maybe learned to sort of live with a bit. That's just the nature of our world currently. I work as a primary school teacher, and I try to educate my 10, 12-year-old students about how important it is to sort of think for yourself and sort of try and find the things that you actually enjoy, not just the same thing that everyone else is doing. But at the same time, of course, you have to be respectful and sort of, because there's something very innate about the curiousness that human has, that if someone else is doing something, and especially if a lot of people are doing something, then I want to know what that is. And that's through social media, that has become such a strong mechanic for our societies, that this, in order for things to be valid, they have to be popular. And this creates this bit strange mechanic that anything that is popular is also sort of validified in people's perception. And that's very hard because, for example, we are working on these ideas that aren't very popular at the moment. So yes, we'll see how it goes.
Well, that's one of the problems I've always had since I was about 16, 17, is that everything I'm into is some strange underground stuff. Almost everything. Because I love 1960s music, and but not just the Beatles. I love like really rare stuff. And actually, I put in some music here which Micheal didn't know. Like there's the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band, right? Who is a band I absolutely love, and Micheal didn't know them, even though
yeah, right,
he was there at the time. So and he said, "Oh, I don't know who this band is." Like he wanted it to be Bob Dylan. So yeah, almost everything I'm into is something strange and unusual that you have to spend 5 minutes explaining. And then the problem with that is most of the time in conversations, people don't give you 5 seconds to explain something. Especially, Mitch, I'm sorry to say this, especially dear Americans. One of the things that I noticed when I lived in Sweden, actually, because I studied in Sweden for 6 months, is Swedish people let you speak longer than British people do. Antti, I mean, you're in Finland. I know it's not the same country, but there may be some similarity across the whole Nordic area. But when I went to Sweden, people let you speak for longer than British people did. And it's the same in Japan, that people have a habit of letting you speak for a while. Whereas in America, people don't let you speak for 4 or 5 seconds before interrupting, and you can't make any points. I mean, Noam said this about the media, that especially in the 70s and 80s, he didn't get a chance to do much media because he's not really good at making 4 or 5 second points. Noam, he has to take a long time to do it, And I think that's a key problem with America, the USA, I should say. And I never watched American TV, but I was in a hotel in Thailand recently, and I saw CNN or whatever it's called, or Fox News. It's horrible. I felt sick watching it because it's a constant 5-6 seconds information bite and nothing going in depth. And I thought it was no wonder Americans that this is what they're listening to every day.
Yeah.
And there's no in-depth, slow consideration of things. And this brings us back to comic books and books in general. In our other book, which is Portraits of Violence, I don't have the English one, that's the Korean one.
Yeah.
Portraits of Violence.
Portraits of Violence, an illustrated history of radical thinking. But yeah.
Right. Noam's in that as well, or one of the chapters. But the other chapters is about Judith Butler. And she said that one of the key things about books is it allows us to sit down by ourselves and read something and think about it slowly. Right? And that, again, that ability of being by yourself right? And rather than a crowd of people like in a baseball match or something, but by yourself, and being able to think about something slowly at your own pace, and how it develops that ability in us. Well, I don't need to say it to you two, but unfortunately, there's a great lack of that in the world, isn't there?
Yeah, that's one comment on Swedes allowing people to talk. I just say that in Finland, the Swedes are known that they're so talkative. So Finland is the least talkative of the Nordic countries, and Nordic countries aren't that talkative. So,
well, that's funny. Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I noticed that when
true.
I was in Sweden compared to British people.
Yeah, Finns are very non-talkative. As for American culture, well, that's a big another discussion. But I think Noam has a lot of points on PR and propaganda in the United States and the need to control the population, because United States is the one country on which the whole global order sort of rests on, for good and for bad and bad and bad, and that's why democracy in the United States is not preferred. But it's that's another thing. But that's also why I think ideas such as participatory economy are so crucial, I think, for the future, because democracy is something that would foster the kind of thinking that, for example, Judith Butler talks about. Because in a democracy, we wouldn't have the need, if we were a democratic economy, we wouldn't have these kind of incentives that our current economy has to sort of prey on our nature and the sort of quick sides in it. And that's one of the things that I hope that ideas for democratic economy progress and hopefully allow more room for people to think and create.
I hope so.
On the point of the media, now this is actually something I've worked on for more than a decade, certainly in the United States, having worked in political activism on media issues. There's a lot that can be said here, but I'll just mention one small point about this, that in the United States as well, there's long been a history about a kind of incentivizing for commercialization of the media in the United States. In fact, actually, we're now in the 100 years ago, where the commercialization of radio was very bitterly fought, and the forces that wanted to make the radio system in the United States, that led to a precursor regarding television and media to follow, were defeated. But a lot of those defeats were, in some ways, kind of self-inflicted. If the popular elements regarding educators and civil libertarians and forces who wanted to turn our media into a more positive force were a little better organized, or even got a couple of lucky breaks that they didn't get, the media in the United States would have been different, and by extension, media worldwide and political environments worldwide would have changed. There's a long history about that, but I'll stop it at there, because it's a whole long discussion to get into. But
yeah, sorry, yeah. I shouldn't have brought it up. Maybe.
No, that's quite all right. No, these are important and interesting issues. I'm glad you did. It's just we got to be careful not to get too far.
Too far off, right?
Right. Sean, let me ask you this. You said you were in Thailand recently. In fact, when we actually tried to schedule this interview, you were in Thailand at the time. You're working on your trip to Thailand is connected with a new book, I take it, or something new. What are you working on now?
Yeah, I'm working on two books at the moment. One is about an illustrated version of Karl Marx, basically, or Marxism, and which is an indication that I'm not anti-Marxist in terms of I'm not an anarchist who's anti-Marxist. It's all interesting for me. And another one is about Öcalan and Kurdistan, and the democratic confederalism, which is of course connected to Murray Bookchin. Is it Bookchin?
Yeah, Bookchin.
I'm terrible at pronouncing people's names or remembering them.
Yeah, but Robin Hanna's work is I think some of his books have gained popularity in the Öcalan areas.
Oh well, I'll ask about that.
Yeah.
So that's the two books that we're doing now, and the Öcalan one is like about 70-80% done, and the illustrated Marxism was about 25% done.
Mm.
So I'm working on those. We're actively working on those two now. But then I want to do something about Thailand because I've been there a couple of times. Well, I just went there as a kind of transfer from Japan to Heathrow Airport in London, and then I went in to do a little bit of lecturing in some universities there about comic books, talking about myself, as I say, is my favorite subject. And it's talking about my books actually. And then I started to see some of the kind of injustice in Thailand and the way people are treated, and it started off with the kind of it really came to my mind about the sex workers which are there, and in the coronavirus time, they were not recognized as being eligible for government handouts. And I thought that was a very significant and very cruel, horrible thing, because they're already kind of pushed to the outskirts of Thai society, and then not given the people who need it the most, who don't have pensions and don't have this kind of unions, etc., are not entitled to the government money, as far as I was aware, or less, or something like that. So it started me to think about, I want to do something about Thailand. And I've been researching it now. I've been finding out, one of our books is called Minamata. And I don't know if you're familiar with Minamata, but it was something in the 1950s here in Japan, in this prefecture, but on the really Inaka, as they say in Japan, the countryside area and the seaside. And a company put pollution directly into the sea, which obviously poisoned the area and went into the fish and then went back into the human beings. Also the cats, all the cats were killed in the area, and rats overran the area. And then this is a very good example of popular activism of an anarchist type, which they didn't call it that, but as far as I'm concerned, it is an anarchist type activism of fighting against a mixture of government backing the company and the company denying responsibility for the pollution and the damage to the human beings. And the town is called Minamata. It's called Minamata disease, but some people don't like that because they're saying it wasn't our disease. We should call it capitalist disease that happened in Minamata. So one of our books is about that. And I've been hearing similar things in Thailand, where there was a company just last year or 2 years ago, and there was a flood, and they used the excuse of the flood to dump a whole bunch of chemicals into the river, and saying that the flood took the chemicals, but they actually put it in deliberately.
Right.
And then when the local people complained, the kind of Thai Yakuza gave them death threats. So it's very. I mean, this is just 2 years ago, or last year, 2 years ago. Right. So I'm beginning to research that, and I'm wondering how I can do it myself without getting killed myself. But we're beginning to research these kind of things, and there's people in the north of Thailand, in the mountainous areas, who are essentially doing collectivist, local, anarchist type projects where they all work together to help the poor people of the mountain areas, because the government doesn't help them, and obviously capitalist companies don't help them because they don't have any money in those poor mountainous areas. But when you look at it, and you look at the collective local action of those Thai people, you feel heartened, because you say, well, this is anarchism in action, even if they don't call it that. So I want to do that book, but it's just at the very beginning, because as I say, we've already got these two other books in process.
And for folks who want to learn more about the works of Sean Michael Wilson, you have a website?
Yeah, sure. You just put in Sean Michael Wilson, the Irish Sean, S-E-A-N, and it will come up straight away.
Very good. This has been Pep Talk, the Participatory Economy podcast, the podcast where we discuss the democratic alternative to capitalism known as the participatory economy. To find out more, visit our website at participatoryeconomy.org. There you can sign up to an online monthly newsletter to find out recent activity regarding a participatory economy, and join an online forum where you can discuss questions related to works or discussions regarding a participatory economy, including the book PareComic. We've been graciously joined by Sean Michael Wilson, who has been joining us from Kumamoto, Japan, at the wee hours of the evening. Thank you so much again, Sean.
Is that you speaking Scottish there? The wee hours.
Well, pretty late, but anyway, we appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us. Antti, thanks for joining us as well. From Micheal in the imperialist empire of the United States. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Thank you.
Could you please tell us what you see as the alternative?
Self-management, democratic control of communities or workplaces, federal arrangement.
Participatory democratic planning.
Jobs to have a mix of empowered work. Nested councils linked to one another. Everyone gets to participate in a primary council.
Please visit participatory.economy.org to find out more and subscribe to our newsletter. And don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks, and see you at the next episode.